Good morning. I want to ask you to turn again today to Mark the 7th chapter, please. Mark chapter 7. And I really want to encourage you, if you have a Bible near you, with you, I hope you do, to open to that passage together with us, please. Mark chapter 7. There are a lot of things I love about this congregation. Too many to count right now, because if I started making the list, we'd run into lunchtime. But one of the things that I love about you is I love the way that you listen. I don't just mean that you are courteous as listeners, because there's lots of groups that will be courteous to someone who's sharing a message. But I love the way that you heed a message, the way that you take it, and that you do something with it. In the last few weeks, I just have seen, I've seen and appreciated how folks have responded to just being more a part of what we're doing in Bible classes, just being present and being prepared. I can't tell you how much I love you for that. Not because of heeding the call to that, but because of what it says about your heart for God. I love you so much for the fact that you want the Word to be a part of your life, that you want to build up your brothers and sisters as we hunger and thirst and develop a stronger appetite for His Word and for how it can help and change our lives. I love you for the way that you respond to that. And I know that God will bless that. The more that we make Him a part of our life, the more we make Him a part of our day, the more that we invest in each other and in helping each other grow, God is going to bless all of that. And so I just had to say that this morning as we begin. I want to read together a text that we read together last week, and I hope that you won't be tired of looking at this passage together for a second time. But in Mark 7 and in verse 31, we read the first of two miracles that I want us to consider together again this morning, where it says, Mark 7 verse 31, that Jesus went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him one who was deaf and who spoke with difficulty, and they entreated him to lay his hand upon him. And Jesus took him aside from the multitude by himself and put his fingers into his ears. And after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. Now move with me, if you would, to chapter 8 and verse 22. In between these two miracles, we read the story about Jesus feeding the 4,000. Just 2 chapters earlier, he had fed 5,000. And so he performs a very similar miracle where he feeds the 4,000 in chapter 8. And then come to verse 22, where we read about the second miracle that the feeding of the 4,000 is sandwiched between. It says verse 22 of chapter 8, they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him, and entreated Jesus to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands upon him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, for I'm seeing them like trees walking about. Then again, Jesus laid his hands upon his eyes, and he looked intently, that is, the man looked intently, and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And Jesus sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. I introduced these two miracles last week and said to you that they are unique to Mark. You can look in Matthew and you can look in Luke and John, and you'll not find those two miracles there. And they're similar as well in the fact that they're both couched right in the middle of Mark's book. And I think they're central to part of the message that Mark is giving us about the predicament of man and sin and about something that's core to the ministry of Jesus, what He's doing here. The miracles are similar, too, in the sense that they're a little bit bizarre. They are unlike the other miracles that Jesus performs, where He makes someone well with a word. Here, Jesus looks a bit more like like a modern faith healer. He looks more like a witch doctor in the way that because he does things that are weird. When he sticks his fingers in the guy's ears, and when he spits on his tongue, and when he spits in the guy's eyes, and there's no other miracle that's progressive where Jesus does something and then asks, "Can you see yet?" and then does something again. But here, the miracle is more protracted in the healing of both men. And so it's just a little bit bizarre. And naturally causes us to ask the question, why are these different? Why does He do that here in such a different fashion from other places? I suggested to you last week that what we have in the situation with both of these men, and this is the case with all the miracles of healing that Jesus performs. When Jesus is removing from someone some physical impediment, the kinds of impediments that He heals people of are representative of just how handicapped man is because of sin. And no more is that more vivid than in the predicament of these two men. One of the things, or three of the things that sin does to us is sin creates darkness, it creates deafness, and it creates dumbness. Sin makes us so that we can't see. Sin makes us so that we can't hear. Sin makes us so that we speak folly. We have a speech impediment. We can't say good things. And the thing that's really bad about how sin affects us is it makes us not only so that we can't see, but it makes us so that we don't want to see, and we don't want to hear, and we don't want to speak anything but foolishness. And we find in the middle of Jesus' ministry here, how big a crisis this is. Because the matter of spiritual darkness and spiritual deafness and spiritual dumbness is something that afflicts not just the disciple who's just beginning his walk. The men that are closest to Jesus are afflicted with this. They are afflicted with not seeing. They are afflicted with not hearing. They are afflicted with speaking foolish things. And so I think the reason why the story of the feeding of the 4,000 is sandwiched between these two miracles is to show us how it's afflicted the 12 and how we can find ourselves in the same kind of predicament. Look with me, if you would, at what Jesus says to the 12 after the feeding of the 4,000. Look at what He says in verse 14. It says that Jesus and the disciples had forgotten to take bread and did not have any more than one loaf in the boat with them. This is 8:14. Then in verse 15 it says, "And He was giving orders to them, saying, 'Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.' And they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus then, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread?'" Now listen to the words of what He says next. "Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hard heart?" These are the men that eat and sleep with Jesus, who walk with Him every day. And He's talking to them about how hard their hearts are. And so He says to them in verse 18, listen again to the language, "Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketful of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said, 12. And He said, "And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large basketfuls of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said, 7. And He said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" They're not getting it. And the reason I bring us to this text is I want to warn us. I don't care if you've been a Christian 30 years. Our hearts can get hard. And I don't care if you've been a Christian 2 weeks. and you're full of enthusiasm right now, we just need to be warned about the fact that sin is pernicious, and we can get where we're not seeing ourselves, and we're not seeing God, and we're not seeing what He wants to do with us and what's next for us. And we can get to where we're not hearing, where our ears are dull and our eyes are dim, and where our tongues, where we got locked jaw, and we can't praise God, and we're not talking to God, and we're speaking foolishness. We have an impediment of our tongue. And so he positions these two miracles to show us what a crisis this can be for believers. And one of the things that we said at the end of the study last week is that the solution to that is not just hanging out with Jesus. And it's not just hanging out with each other. These men are with Jesus every day, and just hanging out with Jesus is not enough. There's got to be something more. And so I want to say to us that just hanging out in a religious service together once a week is not going to get it. And it doesn't matter how inspiring the singing is. It doesn't matter what good prayers we have. It doesn't matter how much work that John gives to the Bible class that he's teaching, or how much our teachers do to prepare for our kids. There's got to be some more to that than just hanging out together. It's not just showing up. There's more required. And so how do we fight the darkness? How do we fight the deafness? How do we fight the dumbness? What's the cure? What's the solution? Well, I want you to see that in the case of the healing of both of these men, it can't just be Jesus acting on them. There is in both instances the cooperation of their wills with Jesus. This is so important to get. In the case of these miracles, these men just don't let Jesus operate on them. They're not passive. Jesus, He asks them, they have to submit themselves. They have to cooperate in their wills with Him. And I want to say to you that if we're going to see, and if we're going to hear, and if our tongues are going to be able to tell the story, there has to be the cooperation of our will with His mighty hand. Now, He has the power to make us well. He has the power to make us see and to make us hear. And He will exert that power, but we've got to cooperate with Him. And so I want to say to you that I want to talk about 4 ways that we need to cooperate. Number 1, in both cases, I want you to see that these men had to get alone with Jesus. I want you to see the significance of that in the stories. They had to get alone. They had to choose to be alone with Jesus. Look, if you would, at verse 32. They brought to Him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they entreated Him to lay His hand upon them. But notice verse 33. Jesus, it says, He took him aside from the multitude by Himself. Just want you to get that. Jesus takes this man away from the multitude, and they are alone together. They are apart from the crowd. The same thing happens in chapter 8 and in verse 22. They bring him a blind man, entreating him to touch him. And look at verse 23. And taking the blind man by the hand, He brought him this time out of the village. And so if he's going to get away from the crowd, if they're going to be alone, he's got to take him out of town. There's a walk there. Do you see that? And here's a blind man, and so he doesn't even know where Jesus is taking him, unless there's some added sense that he has from being blind about having some notion of where he's going. But Jesus takes him out of the village, and this man is content to go and to be by himself with Jesus. I just want to emphasize how important that is for us to see and for us to hear and for us to be able to tell the story. We've got to get alone with Jesus. That's why just being here together is not... You and I have got to spend some time alone with Him. Away from the crowd. Away from the multitude. Because it is hard. It's hard for me to sit in an assembly like this and really look at myself honestly and soberly and introspectively. Because the distraction of being with you gets in the way of me just just me contemplating my relationship with Jesus and Him having full access to my heart, Him having full access to my mind, Him looking inside of me and showing me the things that I need to be shown, the things that I need to see. I need some time alone with Him for that to happen. And one of the things that Jesus is doing at this point in His ministry with the 12 is calculated to do that very thing. What's happening at this point in His ministry is He's trying to spend time alone with them. He's trying to pull them apart, away from the crowd, away from the multitude. When He talks to them about the feeding of the 4,000, He has a private interview with them where He says to them, look, these people have been here, the whole crowd's not listening to this. It's just Him and the 12. And He says at the opening of chapter 8, look, these people have been with me now 3 days and they don't have anything to eat. I can't send them home. And so we need to feed them. And so this is to test their hearts. They need that conversation alone with Jesus. And after the healing of the blind man, we read about how He takes them to a place called Caesarea Philippi in verse 27. And He starts talking to them about what's the crowd saying about me? Who do they say that I am? And then He asks them, and it has to be a personal question, who do you say that I am? Peter, who do you say that I am? What do you believe about me? John, James. You see, all of them, they've got to have that kind of private interrogation with Jesus. And you and I need that kind of private interrogation where we are face to face with Jesus in secret, and where He looks into our soul and we look into our soul with Him, where we have the mirror of His Word before us, and where we look at how do we look to Him. We need that time. And so getting alone with Jesus is just a critical part of our seeing and our hearing and our having our tongues loosed. Secondly, I want to say to you that once we get alone with Him, we need to trust His radical words, His radical methods, and His radical timing. Jesus does things with both of these men that are unorthodox. He does things with these men that are intrusive. He says things to this man. He speaks to a man that's deaf. He says, "Ephatha." And this man, I expect that maybe he can read lips, but he's talking to a deaf man. He sticks his fingers in the guy's ears. This is unhygienic. Would you let someone spit on your tongue? Would you want someone to spit in your eyes? And so Jesus does things that are bizarre. They're weird. They're quirky. They're unorthodox. They're invasive kinds of things. And Jesus, as disciples, when we bring our hearts to Him, when we read His Word, when we think about how He's working in our lives, and there's things that happen to us, and we trust that He is the Lord and that He's in control. He's the King of my life. But He does things around me sometimes. I don't know why He's doing that. Why did you put me here, Jesus? Why am I going through this? I'm trying my best, and yet this is hard where I'm at right now. Why are you doing this? Sometimes He lets us go through things that are radical, that we can't make sense of. And sometimes we read His Word and we say, that can't mean what it says. That can't mean that. He can't be saying what I think He's saying. That happens in this context. When they go to Caesarea Philippi, He asks them who I am. Peter says, I think that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus begins to tell them plainly, you know what, Peter? We're on our way to Jerusalem, and when we get there, I'm going to be given into the hands of the leadership. And I'm going to suffer, and they're going to kill me. And 3 days later, I'm going to rise from the dead. Now, that can't be literal to Peter. I mean, that can't be. And so he tells Jesus, no. He rebukes Jesus. That can't be. You can't mean what you're saying here. Listen. You better be careful when you tell God you can't mean what you're saying here. We need to, when we read His Word and when we see something there and when it calls for a change, I better be careful about talking back to God and saying that doesn't mean what it seems to be saying. Now it may be that it's figurative, but Jesus wasn't talking in figures here. He was talking literally about what was going to happen. And so when you get alone with Jesus, you got to trust when He says things to you that are radical words, and when He does things in your life that are radical methods, and when His timing, when it seems like the healing is protracted rather than just being immediate, when He doesn't immediately remove the burden, when He lets us hurt for a little while, when His answer isn't like obvious and right away, when He lets us see a little fuzzy before He lets us see clearly, when He sticks His fingers in His ears, when we get spit on our face. I mean, it may not be what we're expecting, but we've got to trust His radical methods, that He knows what He's doing. He did that with them, and He's going to do that with us. And if we're going to see, if we're going to hear, if we're going to be able to tell the story, we've got to trust. Number 3. If we're going to be cured of darkness and deafness and dumbness, this is such a critical part of the healing. We have to be willing to suffer humiliation. You know, I think that one of the things that Jesus is doing with the deaf man and the blind man is He's showing us the total humility that it's going to take if we really want to see and if we really want to hear. If I said I want to help you out, you come to me with some kind of spiritual need, and I said let's go out back here, and part of the solution is for me just to humiliate you. Are you game for that? Are you ready? Are you ready for me to spit in your face? I mean, that's what Jesus does. He spits in this guy's eyes. He spits on this guy's tongue. It's not just that that's unhygienic. It's the humiliation that's a part of that. Do you see that? We spit on the ground. And so when you spit on people, I mean, that's why that's such a humiliating thing. It's treating someone like dirt. When you don't spit on people. But in both cases, these men submit to that. They submit. They submit to Jesus' bizarre methods. They submit to the humiliating treatment that He gives them. But the fact that they submit to that the cooperation of their will with Jesus to suffer something so humiliating is an indication of where their hearts are and where their trust is with Him. That they will let themselves experience, they'll let themselves experience that with Jesus. And it says something about, it says something to us about how humble we need to be with Jesus if we really want to see it, if we really want to hear, and if we really want our tongues to be loosed. The requirement that's called for, how humble I need to be, what mistreatment even I will suffer for Jesus to make me well, for Jesus to heal me. Because we are apt to say, I won't cross that line. I won't go that far. That's going to be too embarrassing. That's going to be too humiliating. I'm not going to open all that up. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to admit that. I'm not going to go there with you. And so we stop short of seeing. We stop short of hearing. We stop short of being well, of Him really operating on the nerves of our soul so that we can be enlightened, so that our ears can be opened. Not these men. Because desperate men will be humiliated. When you can't see and you want to see, you will do anything to see. And when you can't hear and you really want to hear, then you'll take it. You will when you're desperate, you will do anything. And God wants us to have that kind of desperation that we will do anything. We will suffer whatever it takes. He tries to make that point to the 12 when, after Peter's objection, he says to him in verse 34, and he says this to the multitudes as well. He calls the crowd back in after his private moment with the 12. And he says to them in verse 34, he summoned the multitude with the disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So he lays out there the kind of humiliation that is going to be a part of really being his disciple. Question: is cross-bearing, is that part of your discipleship? Now, to really answer that question, you really got to look at yourself to answer that question. I mean, what does the cross, what does bearing your cross, what's that look like in your life right now? Is that, Jesus says that's the way disciples are. That's the path of a disciple. Is that your path? Because humiliation, it's a part of it. It's a part of how He causes us to see and hear and speak. And so there has to be that element in us if He's really going to make us well. Number 4, if we're really going to see, we need to make His blessing a platform. Let me, before I finish the sentence, let me stop and just let that sink in for a moment. We need to make His blessings, the new blessing we experience, the healing, a platform. And I want to say what kind of platform in just a moment. I want you to notice at the end of the healing there, look at verse 36 of chapter 7. It says concerning the deaf man, he gave them orders not to tell anyone. So apparently his disciples were, or maybe the men that brought, that's probably more the case, the men that brought this deaf man to him. He gave them orders not to tell anyone. But the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. Look also at the healing of the blind man in verse 26 of chapter 8. Look what he does here. He takes him out of the village, remember, to heal him. And in verse 26, he sent him to his home saying, don't even enter the village. You know, last time he told them not to tell, and they went and told everybody. And so this time he tells them, don't go through town. You take the long way home. You go straight home. You don't talk to anybody this time. And there are several reasons why Jesus, I think, commanded silence from those that he heard. I mean, for one thing, he's not looking to cause a sensation with his work. He's not looking to be a miracle worker and to gain a following because he's just making people well or because he's filling them with bread. He's come to save our souls. And if all he does is heal us of our diseases so that we just die again of something else and lose our soul, then what good has he done? And so he's come to do a bigger work than that. And every time he does works and his fame broadens, it only increases the animosity of his enemies and hastens their plans to do away with him. And so there are reasons why he recommends silence. But it occurred to me in looking at this text that not only can their broadcasting the work that he's done for them, not only can it thwart his mission and his ministry, but it can also do something to thwart their healing. This is what I mean by that. It happens all the time. Somebody is in a fix. Somebody is a bind. And they pray, God help me. God make this better. God help me with our financial situation. Help me with my marriage. Help me with this. And so then God helps us. And you know what happens when God helps us? We get worse. We get worse. I mean, God drops a big blessing into our lap. God does something amazing in our life. God does something to give us a great victory. And then we forget God when the victory's over. We press on, and it's become a platform not for our betterment, it's become a platform for our demise. And hearing and being able to speak without stuttering and being able to see again, if all it does is create a platform for the deaf man and for the blind man to say, look at me, look at what Jesus did for me. If all it does is create a sensation around them, then how does that help them? And if it only becomes a platform for a self-centered life, I'm free now so that I can see I can travel the world and with these good eyes that I have now, and I can see all kinds of things I haven't seen in such a long time or never. I mean, if it becomes a platform for just carnal living, then how's it benefited these men? They need to spend some time thinking about how this can put them in a new position to serve God in a better way, because they can see now and they can hear. And so there needs to be some celebration that's not gaining them any kind of fanfare or distracting them from the kind of spiritual consideration that needs to be a part of this new lease that they have on life. And so I want to say to you that if we're going to be cured, we've got to make His blessing a platform for His service. For His service. And not for our celebrity, and not for our status quo, our new status quo. Because we can have a victory, and the victory can be all about us. Look at what God did for me. Or we can experience a great victory, and then we just get stuck again. But in a new kind of stuck, because now we can see, but we still don't see. Now we can hear, but we're still really not hearing. And so we find ourselves, God lifts us up, and then we get stuck again. And that's what's happening with the 12. They have seen, they've experienced amazing things, but they've gotten stuck. They've gotten stuck. And Jesus is trying to get them unstuck here. And you and I, we can get stuck. We can get stuck because God blesses us, but it goes to our head. Or it ends up becoming paralyzing, the blessing that He shows us. Because it doesn't become a platform for His service. We don't look at our blessings that way. And we've got to learn to look at them that way. When we don't get stuck, Jesus doesn't want His healing and His help for us just to be an event in our life. He wants it to be a habit. And we will never fully know His power and how His power would work in us unless when we experience His blessing, we say, look at how God's blessed me and what this can be for His service, so that we can then experience the next thing that He would do. Do you see that how if He blesses me and I get stuck, then I never find out where that blessing would take me. I never really experience where He would go next. And the 12 will eventually get that. They will experience where it will go next. And He wants to succeed in us in the same way. So that He keeps growing us and maturing us. And we don't just plateau in our relationship with Him. If we get alone with Jesus, if we will trust His radical words and methods and timing, if we will suffer humiliation to see, if we will make His blessing a platform for His service, then the thing that is so wonderful about these two miracles and so wonderful about this text is that when we will do anything to see and to hear, then Jesus will do anything to make it happen. he doesn't want to make this guy that can't hear just partially able to hear. He makes him all the way well. And the blind man, he doesn't leave him just seeing fuzzy people that look like trees. He wants him to see fully. And so Jesus will go all the way. I mean, He will go to whatever length for us to really see and for us to really hear and for our tongues to be able to tell the good news and for us not to be awkward in our words and for us not to speak foolishness. Jesus wants us to be fully well, and He will do whatever it takes to make it happen. And if I will be humiliated to make it happen, then He will be humiliated. The book of Mark ends with Jesus getting spit on. The book of Mark ends with Jesus being crucified. It ends with all the things that He suffers because He will go that far to open our eyes. He will go that far to open our ears. He will go that far to loose our tongues so that we have something good to tell. He'll do all of that. There's nothing standing in the way of us being well with Jesus. As far as He's concerned, it's my will, wanting that, cooperating with that, being surrendered to that. God will be humiliated to make us better. Isn't that wonderful? We have a God who will let mankind treat Him like dirt so that He opens up our hearts to see His heart for us, so that we want a relationship with Him. The same relationship with Him that He wants with us. What a blessing that is. There is no reason for any of us to walk away not seeing. No reason for any of us to walk away not hearing. No reason for any of us to walk away with tongue-tied about the goodness of God in our life. Because He will do whatever it takes to open our eyes and our ears and our tongues. Isn't that wonderful? We're going to sing together. And I want to say to you, we got something to sing about. We got something to sing about. We got something to praise Him for. And if you're burdened this morning in darkness, if your ears have been deaf to the Word and to the will of God in your life, let Him stick His fingers in your ears and clean out the wax. I mean, let him take the scales away from your eyes so that you can see. Come to Jesus this morning, won't you? And don't just come today, but make that a habit in your life. It's together we stand as we sing.